Welcome to the Crafted Conversation with me, Marcus Sharrod, where we give consideration to the art of performance and development in the classroom or instructional environment on the coaching field for sports coaches, and consider a culture of performance where conversations will explore anything from instructional methods, teaching and learning, which is informed by educational and cognitive psychology, motivation theory, cognitive biases, designing programs of learning, the use of feedback and assessment, and also consider group dynamics and performance as well as individual performance. None of this can be explored without the lens of identity and storytelling and generating a sense of belonging within the cultural performance in which we exist. So, without further ado, we continue with today's crafted conversation. Welcome back to another crafted conversation this afternoon with Katharine Radice. Katharine is a classicist, teaching Latin and Greek and classics, most of her career in the independent sector, and now teaching in university and part-time in state comprehensive. Catherine has found herself going down to a sort of part-time and more diverse role because she is and will be having a book published in 2025 on the Bloomsbury Education List. And this will focus particularly on her interests and curiosity around exam stress as a phenomena in 21st century education, and will define itself as a practical guide for teachers. That's coming in 2025, and I'm sure we'll be getting into lots of information and detail on its contents through the course of this crafted conversation. Katharine is particularly interested in how life in the classroom intersects with wider personal and emotional development and mental health. Katharine, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, exam stress, what brought you to your curiosity and interest around this topic?
So I've been teaching for about 20 years. And as you said, at the start of my career, I taught in quite highly academic independent schools. And in the course of that time teaching, I kept thinking, I'm teaching these kids who are really, really able. They're working really, really hard. They're all set to do really well. And yeah, I can see in their faces, I can see in their bodies, their attitudes, an increasing degree of worry, fear about how those exams are going to go and what the outcomes will be like. And I suppose it's been an idea that's been bubbling along in my mind for a long time. You know, what are the reasons for this? Why are these kids feeling increasingly worried? And why does that worry manifest itself? Not just in the kids for whom exams really might be a bit rocky, but also, and arguably especially, in those kids who are on track for doing so well. So the book kind of looks at why that might be and what we as teachers could do to try and help reduce that level of exam stress that so many students seem to be feeling right now.
Yeah, I mean, as you and listeners know, I work in that type of environment that you described, at sort of the sharp end really of what the independent sector is in a full boarding school. And I definitely acknowledge and recognise those observations. I'm really interested to ask how, if at all, you've observed approaches to that exam stress in the maintained sector.
So I think it's there as well. As part of the preparatory work for the book, I've been doing a lot of interviews with teachers in different types of schools, in different sectors, up and down the country, different geographical regions. And in the interviews I'm doing with people who are down on the ground, just to see actually what is it like in different places. You know, one of the opening questions is always, what do you see? How bad is it in your school? Because I think with this, it's really important not to over-egg it. Like, I wouldn't want to be suggesting it's more than it is. And one of the questions I often ask the people I interview is put a number on it. can you give me a rough sense of how many of your pupils, in your experience, are problematically affected by exam stress? And by problematically affected, I mean affected in a way where it's starting to either impact their health, they can't sleep, they're, losing weight, they're looking ashen, or it's impacting on their academic outcomes. And it is hard to put a number on it. It's really difficult. But the lowest number anyone has given me has been 10%. So I would say that exam stress is something which really is kind of digging its claws into our students. It is happening across the country. And it's one of, I think, the main issues that pastoral leads are really thinking about. Because even when there are other issues kind of panning out, like, kind of risky sex, getting involved with drugs, that kind of thing, often a fear about academic outcomes or a disengagement from school driven by relationship with outcomes. Often that seems to be feeding into other pastoral areas as well.
What's changed?
I think that's a huge question, isn't it? It's a huge question. And in a sense, that's why I'm writing a book. I think a lot has changed. I think there's the big stuff. I think the world has changed. I think adolescence has changed. There's that brilliant book that came out this year, The Anxious Generation. I think people are, in countries like ours, more worried in general. I think COVID obviously played its part. COVID unleashed this fear bomb into the collective psyche, and it's quite hard to kind of pull back from that. But I think in terms of what's changed in education, I think the biggest thing that's changed is that standards have got higher. So, if you're chasing an A and A star, syllabuses have got bigger, mark scheme grade points have got higher. So, aspirations have kind of raised, but also the whole process has become a lot more rigid. Because you've got really, really clear mark schemes. That means that when we're teaching to the test, we've all got to do that. I'm really realistic. We've all got to teach to the test. But when we are teaching to the test, it's much more of a not just here's what you need to know, but here's how you need to answer. And that how you need to answer has become really, really fixed. And I think it's in that rigidity, that idea of you've got to do it exactly one way and it's got to look like this. I think it's in that rigidity that the kids become so nervous, because the flip side to that rigidity is, as a student, as a GCSE student, you can't rock up in that exam thinking, I'll just make a sensible decision on my own. You have to remember the way you've been told to do it. And, we all know that, confidence fundamentally rests in, do I back myself to make a sensible decision on my own? And I think that's the bit that's kind of got squeezed out of education a bit over the last 15 years.
So we're almost describing a lack of agency, a lack of academic agency in delivering your knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've got a lack of agency, which, don't get me wrong, the kind of mark scheme culture is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Kind of really clear mark schemes make things transparent and fair. There's an upside to all of that. But the flip side is exactly a lack of agency, that as a child, you don't get to turn up and think for yourself in the exam. You really don't. Like, you turn up and you remember the processes and the shapes you need to answer within. But I think the really kind of potentially toxic bit for kids, particularly really ambitious, focused, aspirational kids, because the ones who seem to be affected the most deeply seem to be at the kind of upper end of that attainment spectrum. You've got a lack of academic agency, but then you've got like a massive, massive messaging dump socially of huge self-responsibility agency. Because one of the big kind of benchmark statements people make all the time is, you can make anything happen if you want it enough. You can make your dreams come true if you try enough. So we've got this really aspirational culture, which again is a good thing, a really aspirational culture. But you've got this kind of mix of, you can do it if you just want it enough. And oh, by the way, you've got to do it exactly the way you've been told in advance. And I think it's the combination of those two together that means a lot of kids are left thinking, if I don't do well enough, it's because I didn't work hard enough. I didn't want it enough. I've only got myself to blame. But they don't feel like they can find the solutions from within. They just have to please a lot of expectations from a lot of different people all at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating lens to look at it, isn't it? How do you clash with, here's your very rigid response to a 9 marker versus here's your influencer you follow on Instagram manifesting a Range Rover?
Right, exactly. and the world is yours if you want it. You can be
Yeah.
anything, but you've also got to be this particular thing. And I think then the other thing that's kind of playing into the mix on that agency idea is a lot of the processes have become a lot more complicated.
Mm.
So that complication, I think, for GCSE students comes in at least two places. It first of all comes in because pleasing the examiner is really complicated. It's complicated enough within one subject, but these kids are doing 9, 10 subjects concurrently. And what the examiner wants in geography, history, chemistry, whatever, it's different every time, even in questions that might feel a bit similar. So you've got
Mm.
that huge complication of what does it take to do it well. Whereas when I was at school, I just rocked up and answered what seemed to be the question because no one had
Yeah.
ever taught me how to do anything because I'm, in my 40s, right? But the other complication is that when it comes to that self-driven bit, go off and revise,
Mm.
that's the bit where these kids are still having to make their own choices and plan their own schedule and so on. I think revision has become a load more complicated because again, if we roll back the clock and think when you and I were at school, when I revised pre-internet, I had my notes on my
Mm.
textbook and that was it. So all I could do was just turn those pages of one book. But
Yeah.
for kids now, when we're kind of talking to them about revision, it's really tempting as a teacher to say, oh, you can go on BBC Bite Size, you could do Seneca, you could try practice papers, there are these revision guides, have you done a mind map, have you, tried the kind of Pomodoro technique or whatever. And as we try and sort of teach revision techniques, and as we try and make sure they're really well resourced with revision materials, yes, we're sort of creating opportunity, but we're also putting a load of complexity into it because for the actual kid at home thinking, how am I going to revise? They've got quite a lot of questions about what am I going to use and how am I going to do it before they even actually start that revision process. And I
Mm.
think that feeds into it a lot as well.
Mm. I a lot of my work, both in school and through the crafted concept, works with teachers and teacher development, and I'm always struck by just the disparity of understanding, safety, challenge that colleagues are exposed to through this kind of cognitive psychology drive around research-led approaches to teaching and learning. So the fact that we just assume that our pupils can just pick that stuff up when in some lessons they're being told do everything on Seneca, and in another one they're being told Quizlet's great, pay a minimal subscription and then you can do your flashcards on there and you can do this and that. And some classroom practitioners have got those kind of Kahoot quiz style things going on all the time in lessons, and others don't believe in them. That, as you say, as I'm imagining, I'm trying to empathise with the student experience as I'm listening to you. Never mind the fact that we talk about cognitive load theory being the single most important aspect of education and learning in general. Some of these pupils must be battered by period 4.
Yeah,
Just the
exactly.
just the change of, even to the point of, and again I'm reflecting as you're speaking, a command word in one subject is different in another.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
just
So
a word.
even take something like
It's
an
a
extended
verb.
answer, right? Like every, in all the GCSE subjects where you have to write at some point an extended answer.
Yeah.
When we were at school, an extended answer was you start writing and you keep writing for like
Yeah.
a reasonable length of time, right? That was it. It's just, fill up this space on the page. But because mark scheme requirements are so sort of precise and we want people to hit all the different criteria in a mark scheme, understandably, if I'm teaching kids to do an extended answer, for the subjects that I teach, I'll say, make sure you do this and this and this and this, get these ingredients in. Those ingredients are going to be different for every
Mm.
single subject. So the complexity of what it takes to do it right is big. And then exactly as you say, like the complexity of medium, how are you going to go about that learning? And I was doing an interview with a student of mine, because the voices that are feeding into this book, as I say, are partly kind of teachers on the ground, but they're also pupil voices. It's also, a lot of conversations with both current pupils and ex-pupils, not of mine, but, people who I've come across, where I'm really trying to hear what it was like for them on that other side of the desk. Because when I walk into a classroom and teach, my experience of that lesson is totally different from the experience of the kids who are receiving it. And when it came to revision, she said two things that really, really stuck with me. The first was the more specific the advice a teacher gives, I mean, great, that's really helpful for their subject, but it's only going to help with their subject. So if you've got one teacher telling you to revise in one way for one subject and another teacher telling you to revise in another way for another subject, then you've got all of this, oh, and I've also got to get the revision process right. And that's really complex. And then the second thing she said was, you know, when these teachers were given advice with the best of intentions, and I hold my hands up and I've done this myself, it's really easy as a teacher not to pause and do the maths of how long these kids have actually got. And let's imagine, you know, you've got people prepping for mock exams and they've got, you know, half term coming up, and most of their revision is going to be during half term. And maybe they're doing 9 or 10 subjects and they reckon they can revise for, you know, let's say max 5 to 6 hours a day, right? Which really is a sort of upper limit. So let's say maybe they're going to do kind of 5-6 days worth of 6 hours each, like 35-36 hours worth of revision. But they've got 10 subjects, right? So they've only actually max got about 3 hours, 3.5 hours per subject. And I think about all the advice we hand out, have a go at this, have a go at that, do some practice papers, flick through this. Are we as teachers actually thinking about, in that 3.5 hours you've got available, you can't do everything. What are you actually going to do? And so some of the advice in the book, kind of the practical strategies that I'm putting forward, are all to do with, if we want to really help students with that revision process, help them carry that agency, that responsibility for, you know, making their dreams come true and how they work. Are we helping them in a way that's realistic? Are we actually saying, okay, you maybe only have got 3 hours to throw at this. Maybe you've only got 1 hour to throw at it. So rather than saying what's the optimal way you can revise, actually let's talk about what the realistic way you can revise is. If you've only got 1 hour, what are you going to do in that hour? What are you not going to do? And actually that question of what are you going to do? What are you not going to do is at the root of all sensible decision making, because it's a priorities question. But how often do we ask it as teachers? Because it's quite hard as a teacher to be saying to a kid, or maybe you shouldn't bother with that bit. But if we're finding it hard to carry the responsibility load of maybe don't bother with that bit because this other bit's more important, what's it like for these kids to carry that load, for whom those outcomes actually are their future?
Yeah, and multiply that by 10.
Exactly.
It's that's a really useful segue actually into my next question around the sort of role of the teacher. But we're talking about restraints of curriculum here in on a sort of meta and more focused level, aren't we? On a meta level, deliver this syllabus in this amount of time, and as you say, syllabi in general have grown, and beyond that, curriculum choice and design at a school level or a mat level or wherever those decisions are being made, what time is dedicated to what subject in what order? When does it start? Do you begin at key stage 3? Do you wait till key stage 4 in year 10? Most don't. In fact, I'd say almost all don't now as a result of the size of the syllabus to deliver. You do have to, for key stage 5, wait until lower 6th. If the restraints are there on just delivering the stuff, the content, then where do we actually have time? You have to be incredibly deliberate and focused to schedule the time in your learning programs to say, here are your revision strategies, and here's the way that we're going to spiral those into our day-to-day, week by week, so that it's a skill that you become honed in, because we can't expect pupils, even earlier career colleagues, to have that level of understanding, because as we know, there's no such thing as a mini expert. There's a novice.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I think that
their
question,
conceptual framework as a novice is totally different to ours. I don't think we acknowledge that enough.
yeah, no, I think so. And I think that question of where do we have the time is a really interesting one, because we're all short of time. We know this. Like, there's no teacher who feels they're kind of sitting on bags of time, or, you know, if they are, I want to sit in your seat, please, you know, sign me up for a job.
Yeah.
But that question of timing is not just about how much time we give to something. It's also about when we give it. And when I talk about life is different on the other side of the desk, you know, one of the ways that the pupil experience is so different from the teacher experience is that our timelines are totally different, right? So as a teacher, we all feel the yearly exam stress as teachers, no doubt about that. We all feel the kind of GCSEs are coming, A levels are coming, IB's coming, whatever, waiting for results day, how did it go? But for us as teachers, that cycle of pressure, like the build up and then the release, because you find out, that lasts for 1 year max, because every single year as a teacher, we get a batch of results. For the kids, that cycle of pressure lasts for certainly 2 years, probably 3 years now, because as you say, loads of GCSE courses are starting in year 9, and arguably it lasts for 5 years because lots of schools are referring to GCSEs as young as year 7 and year 8. So that pathway, that build up to GCSE, one of the other thing that's in the mix for exam stress is the earlier you start talking about it, the longer these kids are waiting for it, and therefore the bigger the pressure about what it's going to be like when you get there. And for a kid who's had people in their ear about GCSE and exam outcomes for 3 years, by the time they get to year 11 and they're sort of 15, 16, 3 years out of their lifetime is a much bigger chunk than it is for me as a teacher. And if they've been hearing about GCSE since year 7, it's a third of their life, 5 years out of 15. So I think as teachers, we have to think really carefully about that question of timing, because the tendency, like the instinct as a teacher, is if you've got something difficult to do and you want to give it enough time, the way you free up more time is you start it earlier. Like you were saying about bigger content, people starting teaching in year 9 for the GCSE courses. But the problem is that, we're adults, right? So for us, starting earlier gives us a longer run up at it. But for the kids, starting earlier means starting younger. And the starting younger is really massive as a concept, because our kids in year 9 actually genuinely emotionally ready to handle the concept that what they're doing now in year 9 is going to feed into an exam in 3 years' time that they know nothing about, and which in some way is going to kind of shape their future. And I think, therefore, what that brings us to is this big question of, even if you've got to start teaching your content in year 9, because again, I'm really realistic about what it's like in the classroom, even if you start teaching your content in year 9, do you want to be talking about the exam in year 9? Do you want to be referring to GCSE mark schemes and outcomes and assessment objectives? Do you want to be referring to that exam speak for 3 years as a run-up? Or do you want to be teaching your content? Do you want to be kind of like testing performance in a way that suits that content? And do you want to save that explicit messaging about GCSEs until a bit further down the line, when that future of GCSEs is close enough for the kids to be able to shoulder that prospect? And I think that for us as teachers is kind of probably the biggest question that is certainly in my mind as a question that we ought to think about as a profession.
Yeah. And how does that inform then the role of the teacher, or the role of, the role of education, if you like, or you can zoom in on the teacher themselves, in being really deliberate in that design piece, therefore in support of emotional and social development and pupil mental health, the sort of whole pupil, if you like?
Yeah, I think it's a big part of it. As a teacher, I mean, look, I hesitate a bit because we all know one of the challenges on the teaching profession is teachers are kind of expected to be everything. Like socially, if you want to solve a problem, if you can ask schools to do it, that's the sort of like catch-all solution for everything, isn't it? We're worried about this aspect of child development, or let's hand it over to the schools or whatever. And I don't want for a second to suggest that I'm expecting teachers to be 5,000 things all at once, because when you're in a classroom teaching geography, you're fundamentally in a classroom teaching geography. But the fact is that the whole child is in your classroom when you're teaching geography, and therefore what you do when you're teaching geography is going to be affecting the whole child as well as their knowledge of geography. So to kind of put that concept in the context of this exam preparation, I can be teaching whatever in year 9 and saying to the kids that, let's think about this new bit of grammar, or let's think about this new concept. What do we think about it? Let's practice remembering it. Let's do a lot of kind of retrieval, recall exercises, all of that kind of stuff. And I can do that. Or I can do exactly that same content, but say all the time, we're doing this because it's going to be in your GCSEs. And you need to remember this because your examiner is going to want to see it in your GCSEs. And the big question that I'm asking really is, given that you can teach the same content and you can drill the same sort of methods, do we have to mention the exams as much as we do when we're doing it? Because as soon as you start mentioning the exams that often, what's happening to the whole child is the whole child is thinking, oh my God, what I'm doing now is going to impact on how I'm going to be judged in 3 years' time, and I'm going to be judged in 3 years' time, and it's going to impact my future, and I've got to remember what I'm doing now in 3 years' time, and I don't know what's going to be like in 3 years' time, and I don't even know, because I'm a year 9, that in 3 years' time I'm going to be different emotionally and, character-wise and all the rest of it. Every single time we mention the exam as early as we do, we're adding something into that mix, which is shifting that child's relationship with their responsibility, their agency, the difficulty of those outcomes, and so on. And I think it is a really, really big question. Like, why do we mention the exam as much as we do? And do we have to? Like, I'm under no illusions. We have to teach the content. They have to know exam technique. But I think there is more of a choice about how often we explicitly refer to that end exam than maybe we feel, because I think a lot of us have got used to doing it by default. I've spoken to loads of teachers who say, I just hear the words popping out my mouth. I don't even realise I'm doing it. Like, I don't mean to mention the exam, but I hear myself saying assessment objectives or success criteria, or, what the examiner wants, or, your band 3 answer. And we've got so used to saying that. Is it popping out by default? And is there a question over how often we want to say that?
A short pause in today's crafted conversation to talk a little bit about Keynote Educational, partner of the show. Keynote have been for the past 25 years the market leader for professional development for educators across the country. Keynote are the trusted provider of continuous professional development courses, conferences, in-school workshops, external examination marking support, and student revision courses. Their repertoire of speakers is extensive and impressive. I myself have and continue to support Keynote with courses across leadership and physical education. Their impressive range of courses covers the whole of the national curriculum, as well as looking at specific leadership within school settings, and those are even extrapolated out to the academic, to the co-curricular, and to the pastoral. So for further information, just head over to www.keynoteeducational.co.uk. Keynote, I'm sure, will be able to provide you with whatever it is that you need in the educational training environment.
There's a real philosophical point to all this, isn't there? It's almost a cycle of fear or mechanistic teaching. You could argue that the nature of the inspectorate means that data around outcomes is important.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually central. It drives funding. It drives success. The Ofsted status of a school, certainly in more condensed areas, drives pupil intake, certainly supports it. And so at a strategic level, that kind of delivering for outcome it finds its way into the classroom. And by finding its way into the classroom, then I, as teacher, want to do the best job that I can. And the narrative tells me that the best job that I can do is to deliver outcome. And actually, in some cases, delivering outcome is attached to my pay.
Mm.
And we've created this cycle of extrinsic outcome, which is on another level, you could be sat having a coffee over at a break time, sort of bemoaning the lack of intrinsic motivation, education for education's sake, the love of the subject. But actually, because so much is externally validated, we're probably driving that. And it's just, as you say, subconscious. There's a subconscious level of extrinsic outcome or fear that's been promoted by almost all sides. And you have to be very cognizant of that to do anything about it.
Yeah, and I think it really is a messaging piece, right? If I were going to write a book saying let's, overhaul education top down to bottom, let's all change examination systems and completely rethink our curriculum, like the book would deserve to fail, right? Because let's be honest, nobody's got the headspace to redesign their curriculum. So what this book is absolutely not is anything saying you now need to teach in a totally different way, you need to change your schemes of work, your assessment schedule or whatever. It's not saying that at all, because I'm pragmatic, I'm a realist. What it's saying is keeping the schemes of work, the assessment timelines, all your methodology the same, because we have to deliver that content. Is there room for maneuver in what we say about that process as we're delivering it? Because as a little example, let's imagine you've got a 5-year-old kid and you want them to take their daily vitamin drops. Okay, and taking their daily vitamin drops is good for their health or whatever. As a parent, you want them to take those vitamin drops every day, but you can choose what you say about it. You can say to the child, it's a really good idea to take the vitamin drops, let's crack on and take them. Or you can say, you have got to take your vitamin drops now, because otherwise when you're 16 you might get sick. And if you imagine the child's experience, if you just say, let's take them, it's a good thing to do, full stop, fine, that's a completely unfrightening message. But you've got to take them now, because otherwise when you're 16 you might get sick. That's a really nerve-wracking message on multiple levels. So my interest is really in that, as we're delivering our curriculum, what are we choosing to say about it as we deliver it? And I think we've all got into the habit of referring to the exams as much as we do, because first of all, we all know as teachers, the first time you say, oh, and it's in your exam, kids kind of sit up, they take it a bit more seriously. So we got used to doing it as a way to drive engagement. But we all know there are ways to drive engagement that aren't that kind of, I don't want to say fear tactic, because I don't think teachers now mean to use it as a fear tactic, but you can drive engagement without referencing exams. Maybe we do it because as teachers it's reassuring for us, because we know we're on task if we refer to the end game. I think we also partly do it because the kids now expect it. Like, I know that if I'm teaching GCSE and I don't mention the exam, at some point a kid will put their hand up and say, Miss, are you going to tell us what's actually in the GCSE paper? And I say, yeah, of course I will. But the time for me to do that is not now, because now we need to think about this instead. So there's pressure at all sides. You've got parents saying, have they got copies of this, that and the other in exam syllabuses and so on. So there's this habit of teach by mentioning the exam at every single step is really ingrained, and it's come at us from all different angles. But the big question, the challenge is it necessary, and is it actually constructive to be mentioning the exam as much as we do? Because if we actually taught the stuff without mentioning the exam until we got a bit closer, would we really be less effective in building knowledge and understanding? Arguably not. And would we actually make it a much calmer experience for the pupils? I think, I go so far as to say definitely yes.
And so what essentially your messaging is around, this is a language thing. This is a language thing, and actually schools have a responsibility, leadership in schools have a responsibility, in the same way that you have your sort of classroom routines that in certain schools have to be utterly rigid in order to drive engagement and behaviour. Well, routines around language. This is how we just, where you would have said X, you now say Y. And as we know, as storytelling animals, that the story and the narrative that we create around something actually makes it incredibly sticky. And the stickier the learning is, we also know when the emotional response is a positive one and a safe one and a curious one. I find myself struggling to combat any of the observations that you make, really.
Yeah, no, I think it is a language thing, and I think one of the the kind of the starting engine for this book for me was just pausing to hear what it is we do say by default, because we're so used to saying it. And the two things, just leaving mark schemes and referencing the examiner on one side, the two things that kind of suddenly like popped into my head was I noticed that all the time that if a kid came to me and said, I'm feeling really nervous, my first response was always, oh, don't worry. And then I suddenly realized that by saying to these kids, don't worry, you'll be fine, I was actually closing down the space for them to talk about and understand their fear. And actually, of course, they're going to be worried up to a point. Anyone's going to be worried going into an exam. But of course, these kids, they don't know that yet, right? So if you've got someone who's worried and says, oh, I'm a bit nervous about the exam, and people say, oh, don't worry, then what they think is, oh, but I shouldn't be worried, but I am. And now I'm a bit worried that I'm worried and something's gone a bit wrong with me and I'm actually a bit doolally or kind of whatever. But then the other thing that I realized we say all the time to reassure with the best of intentions is, if someone's going up to a test and they're worried and you say, oh, don't worry, just do your best. And we say, just do your best all the time. But if you're kind of aspirational and motivated, just do your best is unfulfillable advice because no one can do their best all the time. And actually, if you've told someone to do their best and they do a bit less than their best, and maybe they could have worked for an extra half an hour, or maybe they could have tried BBC Bite Size, or maybe they could have done an extra past paper, how do they live with that sense that they didn't? So, a lot of what's in the book is kind of analysis of, well, if we say this, what these kids are hearing is arguably this, but if we said something else, so actually rather than saying just do your best, like actually all you can do is just say, look, put a sensible amount of effort in. But that idea of a sensible amount of effort, we need to help these kids work out what a sensible amount of effort is, because the more we talk about the sky's the limit and there's all these different resources and all these different options and all these different methodologies and we all learn in different ways, and have you just found the way that works for you, like a sensible amount of effort, I think has become a lot harder for kids to decide on their own. And quite often what I say to my GCSE classes now is, right, you tell me what you think you're going to do revision wise, and the way I can help you best is I can tell you whether or not I think it's sensible. And I say to them, I can't guarantee an outcome, but I can tell you whether your decision making is sensible. And you can see a look of relief on the faces that if someone just says, actually, do you know what, out of all this complexity, your decisions right now, your method, your resources, your time frames, do you know what, those are good decisions, that's the reasonable best you can do right now. That is reassuring in a way that just do your best, you'll be fine, you'll ace it, you've got nothing to worry about. I don't think that type of language, although we mean it really well, it's not as reassuring as we hope it's going to be because of what it also messages on the side.
They still walk out and they feel good about themselves or the conversation they've had with you, but then they go, what the bloody hell am I going to do to start then? Like, what does starting look like? What will that be? I mean, that is where I just so staunchly believe that we should be modelling and scaffolding in every lesson, and that includes modelling activities, it includes modelling revision style activities to signpost. This is the kind of thing you could. A question I find myself asking my pupils a lot at the moment is, did you need me for that? Having delivered a really quite basic retrieval style activity or something like that, model it in the classroom. Did you need me in order to do that? No, we didn't, sir. And then ensure that learning outside the classroom in some way challenges you, and then do something with the feedback that challenge gives you. It's a pretty simple, steady away message that doesn't have any outcome attached to it, other than challenge.
And the idea of the positive next step, I think for kids who are really, really sort of like disaffected, disengaged, the kids who aren't working because they are, genuinely and realistically worried they're not going to do well, you get one sort of disengagement. And then the kids who are hyper working because they're really, really worried whether or not they're going to do well, that's a different sort of situation. For the kids who don't even know where to start because they're so overwhelmed by the complexity and they just can't see their way through it, that first step, I was talking to a fantastic inclusion lead who said, they just need to know how to start. And the more options you give them, it's like choosing in a restaurant, the more options you give them, the harder it is to know where to begin. Whereas actually, if it's like, do you know what, just use this one textbook, use this one website, start at the start and do one thing with each chapter or whatever, you've actually got a kind of an achievable outcome there. But the idea of the positive next step, like it's really useful as we've always teachers got to help people work out what that positive next step is. what am I going to start? What am I going to choose to do? What am I not going to do? But the positive next step is always really, really reassuring, because I always say to the kids I work with that, no one can guarantee your outcomes. Absolutely. If you do get a load of disappointing outcomes, you're going to feel really raw. Like, it is going to hurt. It is going to be upsetting and disappointing. But that's temporary, because there's always a positive next step. And what you need to remember is, come results day, if you don't get what you're hoping for, take a deep breath and then ask yourself, all right, what's my next step going to be? And in that, there's always a positive next step. There's a kind of deep reassurance that these kids really need. Because as we all know as well, like, GCSEs are in view for a very long time, but they also fade from view pretty quickly. And I think the kids need our help sometimes in remembering, yes, they matter to you right now. These are the biggest things you've done at the moment. Of course they matter to you. We respect, we empathise with that. You are going to care about the outcomes. But trust me, once they happen, you move forwards, and in time, they fade from view.
Yeah. And that longevity view on things, that panorama, is really good for them. It's being able to view much further than the immediacy, which we know is really difficult already for a teenager and their limbic driven adolescent brains.
And I think the other kind of, final thought really, the other thing that's in the mix with this messaging is, some of the research I've been looking into is really interesting kind of cognitive science work. And it's about the brain's natural tendency to really simple ideas. And we see this play out all the time in friendships, right? A kid who's worried about their friendships will say, oh, everyone hates me. Or, they're always horrid to me. Kids at that age, particularly in adolescence, particularly with the kind of, prefrontal cortex restructuring that's going on right then, kids gravitate to really simple statements, a kind of all or nothing mindset. And as teachers, as mature adults, we have to really help them balance that out a bit. So, the kid who's really worried about, oh, my mocks are going to go really badly, that's a really simple statement. Actually, maybe it's only that they're really worried about this bit and that bit, and these other bits they aren't worried about. And they need our help in kind of putting that nuance back in, so they can see that it's not everything they're worried about, it's just a bit. And I think that idea of trying to help kids move from the simple statement to the nuanced idea also plays into how we talk about the importance of GCSEs. Because one of the kids I interviewed said, actually, it wasn't helpful at all when I was really, really stressed. And all these teachers said to me, oh, your GCSEs don't matter much in the long run. Because I was like, well, they do matter to me right now. And that kind of complexity of message of they are really important now, but they will feel less important to you in the future. If all we say is they really matter, that's not a nuanced message. And if we flip to the other extreme and say, you're not going to care about them when you're 40, that's not a nuanced message either. Like, actually, you have to keep both in view. And adolescents really need our help with this sort of like balanced, nuanced thinking. They really matter to you now. And in 10 years' time, you're going to feel differently. And that sounds simple to us because we're adults, we're used to that. But for 15-year-olds, it can be really difficult to hold both those things in their head at once.
Well, yeah, their brains are naturally wired to struggle to sort of complete any kind of temporal discounting, thinking about things over time, and they're anchored by whatever the message is. So, as you say, yeah, if there's been one bad outcome or one bad interaction with a friend, then everything's bad. That's how things work, and that's certainly how their brains are wired to be. And it's our job, as you say, to expose them to nuance.
Yeah.
I have thoroughly enjoyed your time and conversation, and will very much look forward to seeing the book next year on its completion. I think you're exploring and delivering messages around something that is so vastly important and been foregrounded to such an extreme. As on the ground teachers that we are, the post-COVID era of pupils, I've just found this to be incredibly exacerbated, and that's not me using my anchoring bias. I'm thinking I think that the work that you're doing is work for now, and not to forget that these individuals are going to go into the workforce. And in fact, these individuals are beginning to find themselves in the workforce, and we're all seeing information that's out there about what that workforce looks like, and the different expectations that they have. And we have to nurture the nuance around those complexities and be mindful of them. So, Katharine, I really appreciate you, as does the profession.
Thank you so much. And as I say, anyone who's interested, please, do look out for the book coming out next year. It's supposed to be practical, it's supposed to be realistic, and it's supposed to be an experience of, my hope is that if you get it and you read it, I hope it will feel like you are reading words and scenarios that ring true and are familiar, and that there's suggestions of things that you think, do you know what, I could actually do this tomorrow without rewriting any scheme of work, without changing any resources, just by changing or thinking about my voice and my reaction. And if that isn't true, send me a complaining email and I'll bear it in mind for the second draft.
Well, it's your authenticity that drives through there. You are currently doing this. You're in a classroom, and therefore you carry an authentic voice that others don't. And the other thing that I should give you a chance to say is, are you particularly active on your socials? Where can we hear about your progress?
Oh, do you know what? I'm terrible on socials. I'm absolutely terrible. I do exist on LinkedIn, and if you write to me, I'll certainly be grateful to connect. But I'm not pumping stuff out on socials. I feel, I don't know, like I know I should, but I
You're
don't.
writing a
Life
book.
is so short.
You're
But there is.
prioritizing.
I do. I'm too old. I do have a website. So if you Google my name, I do put updates on the website. And there's a contact form on the website. I'm doing increasing amounts of work with schools, with individuals, talking about this. If you're interested to further the conversation, or you're interested in doing some work on a school basis, drop me a line and I will get back to you ASAP to try and fix something up.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Katharine, for your time, and good luck with finishing the book off.
Thank you for having me.